And a very good evening to you, and welcome to today's edition of Politics 101 on a Thursday evening. I would like to welcome all of you down to our program. It's, as I said, Thursday evening, and tonight we are going to continue our coverage of the issues that are relevant to us, issues in the news. Tonight, I want us to have some frank discussions. And in the process, I would be replying. To some of my friends. And we have called the program tonight, Replying to Ravidev et al. And we are going to understand why we are doing that. We're going to understand why we are doing that. In the meantime, please share the link. Please share the link. Please share the link. And I would like to welcome all of you, whether you're joining us from Guyana or you're joining us from outside of Guyana. Welcome to Politics 101. Wonderful program last night. Wonderful program last night. Oh my goodness me. Eric Phillips was here and we talked about African Guyanese history, Black history, and so many of you said so many things were clarified. Wonderful program, and we are going to rebroadcast that program, but we're going to try to get Eric and so on to come on a little bit more often. Because those are important issues. Lots of you messaged me about the Arab slave trade because people thought that the transatlantic slave trade was the only slave trade. That before the transatlantic slave trade, there was the African slave trade or the Eastern slave trade where Muslims, Islamic people, Muslims, Arab Muslims, captured Africans as slaves and took them to what is now the Middle East and Pakistan and India and so forth, Bangladesh. Of course, back then, they were not countries, but took them there and the women were turned into concubines, the men were forced to fight in armies for the Muslims, etc., etc., etc. And that Eastern slave trade is very important. We don't talk a lot about it because of the transatlantic slave trade, which followed. But the point there that before the transatlantic slave trade, Africans were enslaved by Arabs, and the Muslim religion played an integral part. It was not always so because Islam at first was comfortable with blackness because the early founders of Islam were dark-skinned Arabs. And so the question of the dark skin was not a contentious issue, but later on, they developed in these Islamic civilization the anti-black notion, and that led to the Eastern slave trade. Tremendous, those of you who were not aware of that. And that has implications because, you know, the anti-blackness that developed really then found resonance in what is now India with the caste system. Where dark-skinned Asians were seen as at the bottom, the Shudras were seen at the bottom of the caste system. And then as Black people were captured, Africans were captured and taken in there, they became at the bottom, they were put at the bottom of the caste system, the Dalits. So the argument, and I think King Gibson had made that argument that, you know, some of the persons who came, Indians who came as indentured laborers, they had come out of a caste system in which blackness was already seen at the bottom of the ladder, and that would have influenced some of the attitudes to the freed people that they met, the former enslaved people. And that discussion was quite rampant about 10 to 15 years ago. But there is a history of African people, Black people, African Guyanese people. There's a history before the transatlantic slave trade. Glorious history. We know that when we go to school, we go to universities, they start us as Greece, the Greek civilization as the origins of human civilization. The Greek civilization, really long before the Greek civilization, you had African civilizations in North Africa, the Nubia, Ethiopia, Egypt. Those were African civilizations. Today, if you go to North Africa, you will see Arabs, because as I was trying to explain, over time, the Arabs captured North Africa and they became what is known as the Arabization of North Africa. So if you go to Ethiopia and Egypt and so on, the people there are Arabs today, but they were not so. At the beginning, they were African people living along the Nile Valley, highly developed people. And then, of course, we know the West African civilizations, ancient Ghana, Songhai, Mali. The Mali civilization was out of this world. The Songhai civilization, very large. Songhai itself, that civilization was larger than France. And the civilization there, those people were advancing technology. They talk about the Iron Age and the Bronze Age and so on. And those people were manufacturing, and they were very urban people. The idea of urbanization, people living in townships, came out of Songhai, very urbanized, living along the Niger River, and some of those cities there. So we hear about the Greek city-states. But before the Greek city-states, there were cities in Africa and those civilizations. Timbuktu, along the Niger River, that is what I usually call the center of learning, the University of Timbuktu. Highly developed in science. So when they brought us here against our will, they weren't bringing people with no skills. They were bringing highly skilled people, highly skilled in agriculture, technology, highly skilled in boating. And it was no accident that in the 19th century, the 20th century, things like the electric light bulb and this lawnmower, all those things were invented by Black people, Black enslaved people in the United States were inventing this technology. The air condition and all those things are Black inventions. But they could invent them because they came with those skills. There's a category of slaves, they call them, category of enslaved people, they call them the industrial slaves. These were enslaved people who would go from plantation to plantation and fix the machines when they go bad. And if we were to follow Governor DeSantis from Florida, he's saying that those skills were learned in slavery. That's what he wants to be taught in Florida schools. But those skills were brought with the people from Africa. Those people could navigate those ships, those very slave ships. They were manufacturing things, highly industrialized civilizations, highly. After the camel was discovered to be an animal that can carry water for a long time, they were trading. Those people were trading West Africa, trading with North Africa, trading with Southern Europe, trading with what is now the Middle East. And so our history is very important because it answers the question, were we people without souls? Because you see, one of the things they said when they enslaved the Africans is that they had no souls. But if you don't have soul, you can't invent anything. You come from a soulless society. So in learning our history, we are beating back that old thing that we were not people with souls and that, we benefited from slavery. Slavery benefited from the skills that our foreparents brought with them. Women owned property in Egypt. So this contestation now about slavery and indentureship, there's an objective to it. You see, the less African people know about their history, the less they can make demands for repairs, the less they can make demands for reparations, compensation. So people have an interest in us not knowing our history. And I have made up my mind that part of my public advocacy is going to be to help African Guyanese to regain contact with their history. Because I think it is important in this new era for us to have a renewed African consciousness. A new African, and an African who is conscious of his or her identity, is not ashamed of that identity, because that identity is linked to how we are treated and how we treat others. In the early decades of independence, the emphasis was on building this Guyana, this Barbados, this Trinidad. And in the process of trying to build that civic state, we downplayed our identity, African identity. All ethnic groups were challenged to downplay their identity. But you see, for Africans whose identity were brutally beaten out of them, this downplaying of identity worked against us the most, because we were beaten, that identity was beaten, and we should have been in the process of reclaiming and regaining identity. And that was interrupted by the nation state, the imperatives of the nation state. You see, when we talk about one people, one nation, one destiny, Indians are not so much affected because their identity was always intact. It was never beaten out of them. But for Africans whose identity was beaten out of them, they were groping for this civic identity, this Barbadian, Trinidadian, Kittian identity as their identity. And so therefore ignoring their African identity. The Indian, the Chinese, the Portuguese, all they did was to accommodate the Guyanese identity into their already cultural identity as Indian people. And so what we are doing today is we're saying, okay, so we know we are Guyanese. But now Guyana means wealth. And so therefore, when it comes to the distribution of wealth, we cannot make a historical demand because we have not put ourselves, we have not embraced that aspect of our identity as much as we should. And so I have made the decision that I'm going to try to help to socialize this new African who will reclaim his or her identity. And in the process of reclaiming identity, you reclaim your history. And in the process of reclaiming your history, you reclaim your soul. And in the process of reclaiming your soul, you then understand your role in contemporary Guyanese society. You understand what is owed to you. And this is what is driving the fear in some of our Indian brothers and sisters. Because they seem to believe that the current state, they've benefited from that state. And so if we make demands on this state, in a sense, they see it as making demands on them. Now, the slave state ended officially in 1838, 1834. And we moved into the successor state, which is the colonial state. And that colonial state carried over a lot of the characteristics of the slave state. And colonialism must last for another 150 years. And the successor to the colonial state is the post-independent state. And neither the colonial state nor the post-independent state did anything to repair the African for what he or she suffered during slavery. The colonial state and the post-colonial state never addressed the issue of reparations. And in that respect, that successor state is then responsible for part of the suffering of Africans. So when I made the call a couple of weeks ago that we should demand reparations from the current state, it is in that context. I'm not asking to demand reparations from Indian people. They don't owe us anything. Indian people don't owe us anything. Chinese people or Portuguese people don't owe us anything. It is the state that owes us. Because that state, the colonial state that followed the slave state and the post-colonial state, never addressed the issue of reparations. And my argument is that this state has the capacity to give reparations. Vincent Alexander put it wonderful last night. He talked about external reparations and internal reparations. That the external reparations is from the Europeans for what happened up to 1838. And the internal reparation is from the state from 1838 to the present. Now, this is sending jitters down our friends, the ideologues, the Indian Guyanese ideologues, represented by Rafi Dev, Betoram Ramarak, and others. They see my call, our call, because it's now our call. I may have sounded the bell, but it's not our call. They see our call for reparations from this state in hostile terms. Hostile terms. And so it is that I want to respond. Let's take a listen here. Let's take a listen here.
Where the argument, and I think this is where the danger comes in, the argument has been made, and we have had this argument with people like Ras Michael and so on in Guyana, which is that A, Africans came here before the Indians, right? They suffered more, right? Therefore, because of prior arrival and because of extreme suffering, therefore, they deserve to have a greater share of the economic pie. And I'm going to cite one example where this argument still continues today. David Hinds has said on one of his shows that reparations has to be provided by the Guyana state, implying that it is the current state. So to me, this becomes double dipping, because you're now getting the Europeans off the hook. Or if you're getting reparations from the Europeans, you're now saying that the current state of Guyana, which should be distributing resources equitably, also has an obligation to provide reparations to Africans. And I think that is where that problem comes in, where we're now pushing an argument that will lead to conflict in Guyanese society, aside from the rhetoric that already exists. I mean, we've seen this. I know Vincent will disagree with me on this. The recent, missive from Roysdale Ford, who.
Good. So we heard Beto there. Let's examine what he's saying. First of all, he's saying if we ask for reparations from first of all, he's saying we are letting the Europeans off the hook. Well, he knows that is nonsense. He knows that is nonsense. How can we be letting the Europeans off the hook? The Europeans are responsible for reparations up to 1834, 1838. And we are pressing for that. We are continuing to press for that. And we are saying that there are consequences of what happened during those 200 and odd years of slavery. So we're not letting Europeans off the hook. Then he catches himself. And then he says, we are double dipping. My God. My God. I hope he listens to himself again. You're accusing people who were not paid 1 penny for 200 and odd years of double dipping. You see, this is why these guys are equating slavery with indentureship. Because they want to minimize the profundity of the economic, physical, political, and cultural violence of slavery. The fact that that man can be accusing us of double dipping. I mean, we should be triple dipping. We should be 100 dipping. So the point I'm making is they still have not gotten it into their heads what slavery has done to the African, that they could accuse us of double dipping. You hear that, man? I think he's more intelligent than that, but it is the rhetoric. It's the rhetoric. It's there. It's there. It's there. It is the thinking. That is why they are trying to water down. They are trying to water down slavery. They're trying to water down slavery. Let's listen to him again. Let's listen to him again.
So the point Mr. Dev has made is that there were Africans who came to make here with the summary is that when they try to distinguish which people seems to ignore, is that they are also, and this is the point Mr. Dev has made, is that they were in a sense minimizing, the effects of indenture and everything that came with indenture. But I think there's a broader point I need to make here when we talk about, the experience of enslaved people, which is that it kind of leads people into a discussion which we have had in the 1980s, where the argument, and I think this is where the danger comes in, the argument has been made, and we have had this argument with people like Ras Michael and so on in Guyana, which is that Africans came here before the Indians, right? They suffered more, right? Therefore, because of prior arrival and because of extreme suffering, therefore, they deserve to have a greater share of the economic pie. And I'm going to cite one example where this argument still continues today. David Hinds has said on one of his shows that reparations has to be provided by the Guyana state, implying that it is the current state. So to me, this becomes double dipping, because you're now getting the Europeans off the hook. Or if you're getting reparations from the Europeans, you're now seeing that the current state of Guyana, which should be distributing resources equitably, also has an obligation to provide reparations to Africans. And I think that is where that problem comes in, where we're now pushing an argument that will lead to conflict in Guyanese society. Aside from
I hope we hear it a second time. So we are double dipping. And that it will lead to conflict. We are making demands of the state which should be distributing equitably. He agrees with us. But equitably must mean that those who were owed should be paid what they're owed. Hence, they should be paid more. Yes. They came here before. They suffered more, including not being paid a penny. The study that has showed that $108 trillion are owed for slavery in the Americas. And the people who did the study are saying that's a conservative figure. So yes, the state must distribute equitably. And equitably means that those who are at the bottom, to quote Mr. Dr. Jagan, has to be given more than those who are at the top. That's what equitably means. But then he pivots. He pivots. This will lead to conflict. How will it lead to conflict? You're saying that Indians are going to push back against Africans getting their due? Are you saying that? Are you saying that Africans are so violent that they're going to create violence? This is what these chaps are into. But I am glad that they are wrapping their minds around our conversation. They're wrapping their minds around our conversation. Ravidev calls for what he calls a Guyanese conversation. I don't have a problem with a Guyanese conversation. But a Guyanese conversation must include the conversations of all of its groups. They want a conversation, a Guyanese conversation that is delinked from the African conversation, from the Indian conversation, from the Chinese conversation. Because you see, the African conversation carries with it a stern accusation, an accusation of the state. A Guyanese conversation carries with it a historical memory of 230 years of enslavement without compensation. A Guyanese conversation carries with it a rebuke of the post-slavery state for not engaging African reparation. So now Ravidev wants a Guyanese conversation, a common conversation that we all agree with, because they don't want the African conversation in the mix. I don't think that these people are racist. I don't go there easily. But I think these people understand that if the African conversation about slavery and post-slavery is brought into the mix, then the state will have to respond in an equitable way, and they fear that. because in their view, they are benefiting from the status quo today. They are benefiting more from the state. And so therefore, if the state has to meet its demands from Africans, then their takings from the state will be altered. That is what is driving fear. At another point in the conversation, Betoram said, Indians engage in delayed gratification. I know where he's going with that. I didn't find the clip just now, or else I would play it. I know where he's going with it. He's saying, all right, so slavery came and ended, and we move into the post-slavery society, and Black people were partying, and Indian people were not partying. They were working hard, and so they've developed assets. And now the Africans come, and they're asking for an equitable share. And that is not fair, because they were partying since emancipation. That is where he's going. That's where he's going. That's where he's going with that argument. Even if Africans contributed nothing by way of labor to the state after 1838, the amount that they contributed in that 230 years will still cover them. But of course, Africans, like Indians and Amerindians, have contributed to the current state. It will lead to conflict. Our demand for internal reparations from the state of Guyana will lead to conflict. So they're telling us, keep your reparations called to the white people. I say to Beto, you can't speak for me, meaning you can't speak for Africans. You can't tell us what our reparations should be. I dare not tell Indians what they should demand of the post-slavery state for the hurt they suffered during indentureship. I've said it plain. Each group in Guyana should make its demands on the current state. The Amerindians have already done so. They've got land. 14% of Guyana's land mass. They've gotten it. They're getting money through carbon credits. And all praise to them for making demands on the state for compensation. And I think Indian Guyanese should make their demands. Portuguese may not have the same thing because Portuguese came here during indentureship. They didn't work very much on the plantation. They were quickly given reparations and they went into business. Same with the Chinese. So they may not have as strong a case as Amerindians, East Indians, and Africans. But these fellas are trying to tell Africans what our demands should be. Our demands have to come out of our circumstances. Their demands have to come out of their circumstances. Our demand is for unpaid compensation, for unpaid labor, and the effects that has had, that institution of slavery. Their demands obviously will come out of their indentureship circumstances. They were underpaid. You see this thing about linking indentureship and slavery. Sleight of hand. Both indentureship and slavery are oppressive systems, were oppressive systems. But it is not because they were both oppressive systems. It means that the conditions were the same. Oppression manifests itself differently. African oppression arose within a socio-economic, cultural, and political system that lasted for 400 years, and that dispossessed them of their humanity. So when Dev talks about this common conversation, Mr. Dev, we're going to have a common Guyanese conversation when we settle certain things. The first thing we have to do is all of us have to agree that slavery was the most inhuman system, and it brought untold misery to African people that persist to this day. All of us have to agree on that first. And if Africans know that all the other ethnic groups acknowledge their circumstances, it is easier for them to acknowledge the circumstances of Indians and Amerindians. And that will be the beginnings of a national conversation. It can't be a national conversation that is based on the silencing of the most heinous crime that is committed against half your population. Mr. Dev, hear me, what I'm saying. Don't bring that sleight of hand to us. Do not. Dev went on later on in the conversation to say Mr. Burnham did a lot for Black people. Oh my God. And he named all the things Burnham did. Again, he's making that argument to say you all already got reparations from the state. These chaps, that's why they're called ideologues and intellectuals. And what they can't take is when we put forward our intellectual arguments. Yes, Mr. Dev, you know very well. First of all, the Burnham government didn't have the resources that this government has. That's one. Second, whatever you say about Burnham, he never governed as a Black leader. His policies were not Black-oriented. Burnham used the one tide lifts all. He had to. He had to. His ethnic group was a minority. He was heading a minority government. He had to take on board the Indian feelings. So he couldn't govern as a Black leader. He couldn't give Black people things as Black people. He didn't. But Dev is using that argument to say Burnham give Black people things as Black people. Of course, Black people benefited from things under Burnham, just as Indians and Amerindians benefited. When Burnham were giving holidays, national holidays are what you call a cultural good. It's a cultural resource, a national holiday, because holidays tells you something about who your symbols are. He gave Indian holidays, Hindus and Muslim holidays. Burnham did that. Burnham didn't give an African holiday. 1st of August, emancipation did not become a holiday until the United Nations in 1984. Burnham died in 1985. Emancipation Day did not become an holiday until 1984. Had Burnham done governed as a Black man, look how they're lynching him today. They would have lynched him 1,000,000 times more. Burnham accommodated Indian feelings. He had to. Hoyt took it to another level. Granger took it to another level. They all accommodated Indian and Amerindian views in the way they governed. And our argument against PPP governments is that it's the opposite. They have never entertained the African demands in their policies. The 57-64 government policy was driven by agriculture, where Africans were almost non-existent. Black bush polder was not created for Africans. Later on, Burnham gave Black people some land there in that part called Zambia. But of the families, less than 2% of the lands allocated at Black bush polder under the PPP went to Black people. And then when there's a scholar, a French scholar, Desprez, when he did it, he found that those Black families had connection to the PPP. So the PPP government, they, to the contrary, they have governed in the Indian interests. And they continue to do that today. Jagan in 57-64 did not, he told the public servants not 1 cent more. He didn't say that to the agricultural workers. The PPP 57-64 government, the emphasis, the developmental emphasis, was grounded in the Indian section of the political economy. This new PPP government, look at how it's subsidizing sugar at all costs. 40 to 50 cents a pound. To produce a pound of sugar, we sell it for 24 cents. And they continue to subsidize it. The majority of sugar workers are Indians. The business sector, big business, is part of the PPP's policy today, their developmental policy. East Indians and Portuguese dominate big business. All these big projects, who are benefiting from them? Who are the contractors? 7 oil blocks given to Guyanese, 6 to Indians. Burnham dare not do that. Burnham couldn't do that, and Burnham didn't do that. So Ravi Dev's argument that Burnham gives Black people things is meant to say, Burnham already give you all reparations, what you all want now from the state. But we see you, Ravi. I may not have read all the books that you read, but I read some. We spot you. So sisters and brothers, we got to continue to do what we're doing because we are really in the fight of our lives. And I keep saying to you all, do not say that thing that we talk too much. You all understand why we got to keep talking. Because at the end of the day, society is driven by ideas. The idea of enslavement, slavery, the idea of slavery, it was taught up by European intellectuals. And the idea to end slavery has to come out of anti-slavery ideas. You all do not give up on the level of ideas. Ideas inform action. And action then it reinforms ideas. And they're always glad when, I understand what you all mean when you all say we talk too much. But if you all listen to the other side, what they think about our talk, then you will understand. Then something explosive came out of Ravi Dev. I want to play it. All you bear with me. All you bear with me. 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 This here is explosive. Bear with me. Bear with me.
So when I talk about the Hyman, who was factory engineer, Mr. Hyman, who was factory engineer, when I talk about the Mounters, who Vincent know, right? Strong PNC people in there. When I talk about all the families in my village of Iflat, the African section, they were basically factory workers who were earning bigger salaries than the workers. So we could talk about small trade where the Indians had used, as Thomas Sowell showed, their own capital of money, of time, and being in that shop. Mr. Burnham introduced the External Trade Bureau, which mandated that all imports must come through the ETB. And all the goods were now given to, not to these small shops, was given to something called Knowledge Sharing Institute. So you see in Iflat, for example, where I used to visit and come back, and every week, every year I would come back after 1979, right? The KSI was located in the African section of my village, where you had to go and line up for butter or whatever you wanted. And all Indian stores were destroyed. What was not destroyed was rum shops. We criticized the colonial masters for allowing rum shops to be outside of the pay office. India never had distilled alcohol. We had a drink called mahua. You take a flower and it was a fermented drink. It gave you a slight high, like bhang that we had. Ganja, you boil it with milk and you drink it, you get a little bit of a high. Distilled alcohol was introduced both in India and here by the British, make us into alcoholics, right? The point is this, that in every area of national endeavor, Mr. Burnham, right, nationalized sugar. Most of the factory managers, the hierarchy was all Afro-Guyanese. In my village of Iflat, a man named Mr. Downs, who would boast that he could call up directly to Mr. Burnham and speak to him. And when Dunstan Barrow, the chairman, daughter was married at Leonora Club, it was raining, and my brother who worked in the sugar estate in the factory could report to me that they use the fertilizer, the urea, to pour it on the road like snow, so the bride and groom could walk from the public road to the ocean, where that guest house is, where Irfan now lives, probably in that guest house. You understand? So I could go on and on, but what I want to ask, that all of these things that Mr. Burnham did, however, for Afro-Guyanese, and by 1992, luckily for all of us, there was a household income and expenditure survey done. And what it showed in 1992, after all of that, and Indians were peripheralized. I don't have to tell you what my parents had to do to make a living. You get me? You mine fowl, you mine duck, you mine pig, you plant a little garden, you cook with something called sawdust. My brother had to go to the loch to get fish. We call it specking. The point is, though, we want to know by 1992, these two groups were yet equal by the income and their expenditure. The question I'm posing, Vincent talks about the psychological aspects that we must question. I think this is crucial if we are to go forward, because this is no slight on anybody. Slavery and indentureship messed up our heads in many, many ways, right? And it's still there. And I still hear people on these Black activist shows, one of them for my friend who I will not mention his name, entertains a lady who calls in, and every single show talks about coolie people being dragged from the slums of India. Only the first 5 years, people were brought from around Calcutta. After that, it shifted to the villages, which the British had destroyed the whole economy of North India. Rather than plant the food that sustained us, slavery and indentureship messed up our heads in many, many ways. right? And it's still there. And I still hear people on these black activist shows, one of them for my friend who I will not mention his name, entertains a lady who calls in. And every single show talks about coolie people being dragged from the slums of India. Only the first 5 years, people were brought from the around Calcutta. After that, it shifted to the villages, which the British had destroyed the whole economy.
Ah, y'all get it? So the friend he's talking about is me. All right. And the lady he's talking about is Rhonda. And Rhonda said that Indians came from the slums of India. Ravi Dev said, yes, the first set came from slums. Now, if you want to say to Rhonda, man, what you say is correct, but it's only correct up to a certain point. The first set of people were brought from the slums. And after that, they went into the villages. That's all Ravi Dev had to do. But Ganesh and all the others jump on Rhonda for stating a fact. The Indianist authority is agreeing with Rhonda. He's saying Rhonda is correct up to a certain point. And Ganesh and them went off as if Rhonda was saying some untruth. You know, I didn't want to say anything on that matter for a long time. Because if I had said what Rafi said, they would have taken it to another level. They would have said, here is David Hines repeating this terrible thing that Rhonda. I know that some Indians came from the slums of Calcutta. It's public knowledge. And Ravi could have said, do not jump on that lady. What she's saying is partly true. But he didn't do that. He allowed them to beat up on Rhonda. And because I didn't beat up on Rhonda, he said, I am encouraging Rhonda. But in the process of saying I encourage Rhonda, he had to talk the truth. Rhonda, you are vindicated. Because what Ravi Dev said is true. The early Indians, the early set, a critical mass of them came from the slums of Calcutta. That's a fact. Ravi Dev just said it. Let me play it back for you all here. You know, let me play it back. So you all are going to say that me said. Let me play it back. Ha 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 ha. Hey, did I play it for y'all? No, I didn't play the thing, man. Let me. Oh Lord. Oh, oh, oh. Come on, David. Come on, come on, come on.
And it's still there. And I still hear people on these black activist shows, one of them for my friend who I will not mention his name, entertains a lady who calls in. And every single show talks about coolie people being dragged from the slums of India. Only the first 5 years, people were brought from the around Calcutta. After that, it shifted to the villages, which the British had destroyed the whole economy of North India. Rather than plant the food that sustained us, we had to plant poppy, right? My great grandfather had to plant poppy to get opium so the opium could sell to the Chinese to get tea. The biggest drug dealers in the world were facilitated by that. So after destroying all of the industries of North India, right?
Sorry about that. Sorry about that. Sorry about that. Roy, no, I consider Ravi a friend. We have had a long relationship because he is fighting, as I understand it, for Indian empowerment, and I'm fighting for African empowerment. And I thought that there are a couple of things we can agree on, and we have, over the years, maintained a cordial relationship. But you know, Ravi, first of all, he knows his stuff. Eh? He's a bright guy. Let's be. This is not Randy Prasad and Freddie Kissoon, who don't know nothing about what they're talking about. Them fellas didn't study race and slavery and indentureship. They didn't. Ravi Dev did. So he knows what he's saying. And because he knows what he's saying, we got to be very careful with him. You heard what he said there? The first 5 years, he's agreeing with Rwanda. And then he said, even those who came from the villages, the British had dispossessed them. So they were very poor. This is precisely the point that Rwanda was making. And all Ravi had to say, do not beat up on that woman. She's partly correct. He says it now. He says it now. You hear him? Every day she calls in. But you know she doesn't call in every day. And when even if she calls in every day, she doesn't talk about Indians coming from the slum every day. But I know what he's trying to do. He's trying to say that all we do on these shows is that we talk Indian people. That's what he's trying. So he's blowing up, you know, and pinning this thing on Rwanda. When all Rwanda was stating was a fact that he knows. Many times I wanted to jump in, but I said, let me shut them out. Because if I were to say what Ravi's saying, they will doubt me. Let the Indian authorities say it. And he said it. Ganesh and them all Rwanda an apology. And I love Ganesh, I love Pandit Ubraj. Again, as I said to Gita, there are matters in which you remain quiet. You don't know certain things. Rwanda is much more informed in that area of Indian history than evidently Ganesh and them are. Because if they didn't know that the early indentured labor, the first 5 years, they came from the Calcutta slum. Obviously, they either didn't know it or they knew it and they still want to cause mischief. And I don't believe they're mischievous. I believe they just didn't know. And they jump on that lady. That is why I jump back on them. Because I knew better. And that's what I'm saying to you all. Let us all become warriors for this cause. We you heard what we call our show? The show, Black Activist Show. Yes, yes, yes. And they're right. I make no bones about that. My show is part of the Black Activist Show. And they don't want black activism. They don't want black activism that is creating a new, informed, conscious African. And Rhonda represents that consciousness. She knows what she was saying. Those who condemn her didn't know what she was saying, or if they knew, they were playing games. Who owe an apology now? Ravi Dev wasn't going after Rhonda there. He was going after me. He used the Rhonda thing to go after me, his friend, because he says, I'm encouraging. I don't mind Ravi. Yes, I'm encouraging black people to become conscious of themselves. And I know that in the process of consciousness raising, some of our people will go a little bit extreme. Some of our people will say some things that on a normal day doesn't fit well. Ravi, no, I don't use the C word. You go in Buxton today. And then people will say, don't use that C word in front of David. Say Indo-Guyanese. They just make fun of me. That C word don't come to me mouth. Indian people use it. In the early days, I used to tell Rhonda, don't use it. Rhonda decided she will continue to use it. I don't use it. Indian people use it. There are books with that C word on it. The C word was the word that was created to describe Indians. I don't use it. And that's a political decision I take not to use it. What Ravi is trying to say is that I am socializing Africans who are eventually, according to Beto, going to go into conflict with Indians. That's what they're saying. On a given day, they say, we are socializing black people to attack the state. Then a day like yesterday, they said we are socializing black people to attack Indians. We are socializing black people to make demands on the state. And I've said here, without water in my mouth, Indian people don't owe black people nothing. Indian people are not our historical enemies. We are in competition with Indian people, and we have to be. We live in the same state, and we live in a state that treats us differently. And so we are in competition. And that competition can lead to conflict. But we are not historical enemies, and I'm not about to socialize black people to attack Indian people. I know better than that. But they fear the real thing that people like myself are doing, and that is consciousness. That's what they fear. That's what they fear, consciousness. A conscious African. You see, the African who go and backs them up and things, they're going to say, well, are you always violent? You all never had a soul. You all were always inhuman. They could dismiss us, you know? But when we box them with knowledge and consciousness, when we box them with consciousness, it's a different story. So, sisters and brothers, that's my reply to my friends. That's my reply to them. And I want you all to share these programs. I want you all to share them because they let your children, especially young people. Rhonda, you are vindicated. You are vindicated. And yes, we want a Guyanese conversation, but it must be a Guyanese conversation that is the sum total of the conversations of all groups. Indian people must have their own conversation about their hurt, but they mustn't compare their hurt or they mustn't measure their hurt based on our hurt, which is what they're doing. Your hurt, your suffering has to come out of your experience. And if you admit that slavery under any guise is horrible, we have to agree on that first. If you cannot acknowledge the peculiar suffering of Africans, why do you think Africans will acknowledge your suffering? There are some facts. Amerindian people hunt down black people. Hunt us down and took us back to the plantations. But when an Amerindian child accused a man of power of violating her, black people rally to the side of that Amerindian. But what it means is that the conversation about African victimhood at the hands of Amerindians is not at the same boiling point as the conversation about victimization by an Indian-led state. And what Beto Ram Ramarak is saying, that Indians are invested in this state, this contemporary state, and that if this contemporary state is going to give reparations to black people, it will affect Indians. And that is precisely our point. Our point is that the post-slavery state has not been just and equitable. Ravi gave a long thing last night that Indians were not given land. All right, Ravi? Indians were not given free land. Indians had to pay a small piece for their land. African people had to pay inflated prices for their land. Land was made available to Indian people at a low cost, below market price. It's a fact. And we black people have been too shy when it comes to telling our story and telling the truth. Yes, Amerindians hunt us down. Does it mean that we go and fight Amerindians? No. No. But we have to say that. So what those brothers are trying to do is to hug. And I am saying that oil that has been pumped out of the Atlantic Ocean, rub up in that oil are the bones of my ancestors. And that oil must be seen as part of reparations. I'm not letting them off the hook. I'm not. They can see me as the number one enemy. You know, how many times can a man die? That's what Black Stalin asked. I die on the shores of Africa. I died on the slave plantation. I died in the 1930s fighting with Critchlow and Butler. I died with Crummy Wing, and I died with Waddle, and I died with Quindon Bacchus. And how many times can a man die? Back to back, belly to belly, and done dead already. You know, it has to be this way. It has to be this way. If Guyana can make right with Africans at a basic level, then I move on. But until that time, I'm fighting for that time. My brother, Kimani Nehusi, said it so lovely last night. He said, the post-slavery state inherited the assets of the slave states and the liability. And when you compare the liability and the assets were more. And that is why that successor state has a responsibility also. So here is it. The Henry boys. Thanks, Rhonda. And Orin Boston. Thanks, Rhonda. Thanks, Rhonda. Thanks. And so we got to keep doing it. We got to keep doing it. Because they're laying the basis for taking the wealth. And if reparations come, and reparations are given to that state is going to also distribute that reparations unfairly. That is why they're saying slavery and indentureship at the same time. So when reparations come for slavery, they will give some of it to indentureship. You all understand the thought process. Even Hitler and his system of apartheid there, he got the best thinkers in Germany to help him with that system. Same thing in apartheid South Africa. And so we have to counter them with thought. And they don't like the idea that we come on these black activist show and that we are creating activists like Rhonda and Carl and Nicole and Rox and Desiree and all of you. They don't like that. They don't like that. Tomorrow night I come back. My brother's going to be here tomorrow night, Nigel Hughes. We're going to be talking about that explosive Article 15 in the Constitution that compels the state to intervene when any group charges that it is discriminated. Nigel is going to be here tomorrow night and we're going to be talking about that. And I know the person who came up with the idea for that article in the Constitution and who wrote, who drafted. Surprise tomorrow night. Surprise tomorrow night. We're not letting up. We're not letting up. Tomorrow night, I'll be back.